So out of all the tasks you do in your business, bookkeeping, sorting out invoices and receipts is probably one of the least enjoyable ones. But this makes a perfect example of how an AI assistant can serve you, taking off all the repetitive and annoying tasks so you can fully dedicate your time doing what you actually love. That's why in this video, we are going to build you an AI bookkeeper that collects your receipts, extracts all the relevant information, sorts them into dedicated folders, and matches them with your bank transactions to make sure you will never miss out again on an invoice. Sounds good? Let me show you a quick demo. Now, what I have over here is a sample list of bank transactions. Pretty basic automation in the background. Whenever we get a new bank transaction, it basically just gets added to the list. So we have the date over here, the amount, and the basic description that we pull from it. And I've set up this Google Sheet folder over here. And whenever I receive a new receipt, I'm just importing it into this folder. We can also place multiple receipts at once over here. And let's see the workflow in action. So I'm going to click Test Workflow. And this workflow obviously is going to run always. So it gets triggered whenever a new file is uploaded in the folder. It automatically gets parsed. So we send it to an external tool, analyze the invoice, scrape all the data over here. And when it's finished parsing, we're gonna rename the file, sort it in the correct Google Sheet folder for our bookkeeping, and pass it over to the AI bookkeeper to try to match it with one of these bank transactions. So back in the bookkeeping sheet, you see that the agent has identified the corresponding transaction and has pasted the invoice number over here, as well as a link to the invoice. So we see the invoice over here. And also in our bookkeeping accounting folder, set up a very basic structure over here. So we basically have all the different months. So January, February, March, and so on. And within all of these, we also have the expenses and the income. And our sample Notion invoice over here got sorted into the correct folder and also got renamed. So your accountant is going to be very happy about it. We have it structured in a way of year, month, day, and then also the name of the vendor and its invoice number. And you find the full invoice over here. Now, what happens when we have an invoice, but there's no transaction over here? I have set it up in a way that those kind of invoices land in a separate sheet for unmatched receipts. For example, you have received an invoice, but maybe not paid yet, or there's no bank transaction found. We obviously don't want to lose on these receipts. We want to store them in a separate one. So in our AI Bookkeeper folder, you see the previous receipt got removed because it got sorted in the correct folder. Let me show you a separate example or another example over here for a linear invoice. And for this invoice, we don't have a matching bank transaction. So if we run again the workflow, it gets again pulled from this folder, parsed again. And once it is finished with the parsing, once we have the invoice information, we then still gonna sort it in the correct folder and pass it over to the bookkeeper. He tries to match it with the correct transaction, but if he doesn't find one transaction in the sheet, it actually gets placed in a separate one, as he does right now over here. Back to the bookkeeping folder, you see our linear invoice. We don't have a corresponding transaction that would match the linear invoice, so it places it over here, still inserts the date, amount, the description of it, gives us the invoice number, and also the link to it. So let me show you in detail how I built out this automation and AI agent. Now, the first part you need is a little bit more custom to the bank you're working with. You need to look up like how can you set up an API call, or how can you connect and pull those transactions from the bank into this Google Sheet, or this can also be any other bookkeeping software you're using. Now, I have set this up in Zapier, usually more of a fan of Make.com, but for my bank, Zapier is like a native integration. So I've decided over here to run this one with Zapier, and it's a super basic one. We basically just receive or trigger whenever there is a new transaction, and I run it through some formatting. I need to format the date. I need to find out if it's income or an expense. And then I basically just map it into our Google Sheet. So we have the date, which is over here, income or expense. We have the amount and description. And everything gets inserted here. So not going into that part of the automation in too much detail, because again, it's highly custom to the bank you're working with. But I mean, in the end, if your bank doesn't allow any automations or any API connections, you could also go ahead and place these transactions manually somewhere. But I want to show you in detail how I set up the main part of it, which is taking the receipt, parsing it and sorting it and also matching it. So I have set up different triggers over here. And this is just to give you ideas of how you can pull in different receipts into your system. So the triggers I have set up is a Slack channel. So whenever someone from the team maybe has a receipt, they can also put it inside of here and it gets pulled into the automation. I've also set up like a Gmail function over here. Whenever I label an email with receipt, we automatically get the attachment and put it into our automation. But to keep it simple for this video, let's focus on one of these triggers, which is whenever something gets uploaded into the folder that I showed you previously. So I've set it up in a way to every minute take a look at the AI Bookkeeper folder. And whenever a new file is created, we're gonna trigger this automation. Let's actually go ahead and take our Notion invoice as an example. So we have pulled the Notion invoice information over here. The first step is I want to move it into the uncategorized folder because sometimes maybe we cannot find out the correct information about it. And then I want everything land in this uncategorized folder first, which is simply a move node over here. So we move the invoice by its ID and I'm placing it into the uncategorized folder. Then in order to parse the invoice, we need to grab a link of it. So you simply insert the link over here from the folder. And then we want to return the web view link. And since we have multiple triggers over here, I want to set up some fields that we always need, which is the file link. So we need the file link where we can view this Google Drive file and also the file ID. We're then going to merge these fields in case they're coming from a different trigger. And I've set a loop over invoices node over here to process invoice by invoice. I've played around with it a lot and found out that this just gives me the best output if we process invoice by invoice. So just in case we, for example, have 5 receipts, I want to go over them one by one. Now for parsing the invoice, which basically means we need to get the invoice data and put it into a text that a large language model can understand. So take the PDF and scrape it. I am myself using pdf.co. There's multiple options, but I found pdf.co like the most reliable one. And they even have a dedicated invoice parsing module, which makes it even more consistent. So you just create an account with them, go to the dashboard, and the only thing you're gonna need from here is an API key. And with this API key, we're gonna set up our pdf.co account. So this is a custom module for an API request. We need this URL over here. And for the authentication, you set up your pdf.co account, which you basically just need to name like this and paste the API key from pdf.co over here. And the body we send with this API call is basically just the URL. So we need to paste this file link from the Google Drive. Also make sure that the Google Drive folder you paste it in is to view for everyone because we need to give pdf.co the access to actually view this file. Now, this module over here just sends it over to pdf.co, and then we have it on their side. It takes some amount of time, for example, 30 seconds, 45 seconds to actually process it, parse it, and then get back to the information. So the way I've set it up is I've placed a simple wait module. We wait for 5 seconds, and then we have another API call over here, which is basically just checking the job. So we have, again, our credentials over here. And then we just need a job ID from the previous node. And you see it run multiple times, so it loops over it and basically checks for this job status. Is it still working or is it success? So in this case, we looped over it for 3 times, so 15 seconds. And on the first runs, we always received it is still in progress, still working. Second run, we looped over it, still working. And on the third one, we have the success and we have all this scraped invoice data. So the vendor name, street address. That's what I like about pdf.co. It gives you everything in this JSON format already, and we can just reuse it later on in the automation. The next module we need is we're gonna turn this one into text. So we simply take this whole parsed invoice JSON over here and paste it into, or like transform it into one text. Now that we have this invoice data, we're gonna pass this over to the first OpenAI module over here to extract the details. So I have a user role down here, which is basically just from the text module, giving us like this whole parsed text over here. And before that, I have set up a system message to set up this module over here and let it know what to do. So for the role and context, I've set that this is an invoice analyzer. You're going to be presented with a parsed invoice, and your job is to extract certain details in a JSON format. As for the instructions, I've said that it should take this whole text and give us certain information back. So the way I've set it up is I want to see the vendor name, so the name of the vendor, and I've also said remove any dots and comma and also remove any legal entity. So for example, instead of Notion Labs Inc., we just have Notion Labs, for example. The invoice number, the month of it, that's because I have structured later on the Google Drive per month. So we have 2025, 01, 02, and so on. So I've set the invoice date, specifically the year and month. It must be formatted as the following. So for example, 2025, 01. And I also want the full date. So the full date of the invoice, including year, month, and day, and in this format. So year, month, day. Lastly, I also want to know whether it's an expense or an income. And I've said for invoices billed to one of my companies, so wherever we are the client, then this is obviously an expense. And for invoices billed from one of my companies to the client, so whenever we are the vendor, this is obviously an income. And lastly, I also gave it an example. So for example, a Typeform invoice, vendor is Typeform, that's the invoice number, that's the month, date, and it is an expense. Also down here, I said it should simplify the output and output as JSON. So we receive it in this format over here, vendor name, invoice number, month, date, and type. So now that we have extracted this information, we can now rename it and sort it. For example, I want all my invoices to have the invoice date first, the vendor, and then the invoice number. So we're gonna first rename the file. We again need the ID of the Google Drive file. And then I've set this up in this structure. You can customize it in that way that you want. So the extract details date, extract details vendor name, and extract details invoice number, all with these dashes placed over here. And if you see the output over here, it renamed it to 2025. 3rd of February, Notion Labs, and the invoice number. So once we have renamed the file, I then want to put it into the correct folder. If you remember this folder structure over here, we have our parent folder receipts, and then we have all the different months down here. So first part is month. That's why we're looking or we're searching for a folder name over here. And the query for this search is the month that we have extracted beforehand. We are going to look in the parent folder receipt, and we get I received the ID of the folder back. So the ID of the folder 2025-02 is the following. And then once we have identified the month, we pretty much do the same and just identify, is it an expense or an income? So within this folder ID of the month, so within this 2025 February folder, we want to search for the type, and the type is expense or income. So over here, we have the expense, and we want to place it over here. Now that we have the final ID of this expense folder within the February, we are going to move it into this folder. So again, very basic note, we take our file and we move it into the folder of February 2025. So all of this is a very linear automation, and we have now categorized our invoice and placed it, renamed it in the correct folder. Now that's actually when we forward all this information to the bookkeeper to, in the last part of this automation, match it with our bank transactions. So the way I've set it up is I've created an AI agent node over here with a basic ChatGPT 4.0 model. And I'm giving over some information over here, which I will come to in a second. But the system message I've crafted is the following. So you are an expert bookkeeper with exceptional skills in analyzing invoices, matching them with transactions from our bank account. I also give it some context. So you will be provided with parsed invoice that has been passed through our OKR, PDF Co. And you also have access to a Google Sheet containing all our bank transactions. And your goal is to match each invoice with the transaction, or if no match is found, document the invoice details in a separate sheet for unmatched receipts. Now, as for the objectives, it should first go ahead and analyze all of the invoice data to fully understand it, then attempt to match the invoice with a transaction from our bank account records. And then either way, if it found a match, it should update the corresponding row in the Google Sheet. If it hasn't found it, insert it into a different sheet. I double down on it with the instructions and SOPs. Always important. I call it out to think step by step through it, to follow it in the right order. So again, first analyze the invoice, retrieve all the transactions. So that's why we have this module over here. So what I've set down here is the first tool, getting all of the transactions. We need to feed the AI agent with all transactions from our bank account. So we need to feed it like everything that's in here. So pretty basic module, just get all rows from our document bookkeeping within transactions. And yeah, you see over here, it pulls in all of the different transactions into the Bookkeeper. Now back to the instructions. So again, it should access all our bank transactions over here. And I've also let it know that transactions that don't have an invoice link over here in this column haven't been matched. So you want to focus on these and only look for transactions that are within the date range of the invoice. Now, next step is to try to match the invoice with the transactions, and it should do so by comparing the invoice with the transactions, like the date, amount, and descriptions. Gave it some notes down here. For example, that the invoice or the transaction date not always matches the invoice date because it can take some time for payment processing. For example, you first receive an invoice, then you maybe have to manually do the transfer, and that can take a couple of days. So those dates not always match. Only look for transactions that don't have a link to a receipt. This means the transaction hasn't been matched yet. And only match it with a transaction if you're very sure that the invoice matches it. Otherwise, store it in unmatched invoices. Then it has two options. If it found a matching transaction, use the match transaction tool to update the transaction row as described in the tool. You need to provide the tool a matching row number in order to update the row in Google Sheet. So let me actually show you the tool I've set up. So I've created another tool called Match Transactions. This is a Google Sheets tool. It's going to update rows within our transactions. And we always need a column to match on. And in this case, we pass on the row number. So the agent needs to provide us with the row number, or needs to provide the tool with the row number in order to fill in this information. So I've said from AI, paste the matching row over here. I don't want to update the date. I also don't want to update any of these other columns, just want to keep it as it comes from our bank. The only thing we want to update is the invoice number and the link. Of course, you can also map this information from the different fields from before. For example, we have already extracted the invoice number and extracted the link, but I have run this automation 100 times and the AI always does the right job over here because we gave it some very clear instructions. So we always have the invoice number over here and the link down here. It just can figure it out by itself. So over here in the instructions, again, insert the invoice number into the column and insert the drive link into the link column. If it hasn't found the matched transactions, that's how I set up the second tool over here for unmatched receipts. That is just appending a row. We don't want to update any row. In the list bookkeeping, we have a separate sheet for that called unmatched receipts. Now, in that case, we want to update all of these columns over here, or all of these fields over here. We want to fill in the date. Is it an income or is it an expense? We also want to track the amount. For the description, I've said it should insert the vendor, and invoice number and link is the same as in the previous tool. So I gave it some more context for the format. It should give us all the information. For example, invoice date always in this format. For the type of the invoice. If it is an income, I'm using this arrow over here. If it is an expense, I'm using this one. The amount, total amount in this format, and description, name of the vendor, and link to the Google Drive link. That's pretty obvious. Down here, I'm just doubling down on when to use which tool. So the get transaction tool is to receive all or retrieve all bank transactions, and always use this tool first. Then the match transaction tool to update the transactions for the matched invoices, and the unmatched receipt for the unmatched invoices. So to round it up, I've also given it some rules. So crucial to our success to ensure that all invoice details are accurately matched or recorded, and double check all entries to prevent errors. Very important. And never fabricate or assume information. That's just to prevent AI hallucination. Stick strictly to the data provided to maintain the integrity of financial records. So this sums up this AI Bookkeeper tools agent over here. So if this video inspired you to take advantage of AI and build systems for your own business, you can work with me by checking out the first link in the video description. And if you want to learn more about building AI-powered solutions yourself, feel free to join our community. I'm going to share this and more templates in it. Also, make sure to write down in the comments what you'd like to build us next. If you want to understand the basics of AI agents, click on this video where we are going to build your first assistant together. And I will see you there.